The flames danced against the midnight sky as 12-year-old Evelyn Carter stood in the garden, watching the Whitfield mansion burn, with the master's children trapped inside their beds. The screams that pierced the Charleston night would haunt the city for decades. But by dawn, the girl who started the fire had vanished into the swamps, leaving only bare footprints and a legacy of terror that no one dared speak aloud. What drove a child to such desperate vengeance? And how did she simply disappear without a trace? The year 1839 brought unusual heat to Charleston, South Carolina, where the grand estates of the wealthy planters stretched along the Ashley River like pearls on a velvet ribbon. Among these magnificent homes stood the Whitfield plantation, a 3-story mansion with white columns that gleamed in the morning sun and gardens that bloomed year-round with jasmine and magnolia. But beneath the beauty of this antebellum paradise lay the harsh reality of human bondage. And it was here that 12-year-old Evelyn Carter learned the true meaning of hatred. Evelyn had been born into slavery on the Whitfield estate, the daughter of Sarah Carter, the head cook, and a father whose name was never spoken aloud. Her mother had died when Evelyn was 8, leaving the girl to navigate the treacherous waters of plantation life alone. Unlike the field hands who toiled under the scorching sun, Evelyn worked inside the main house, her small hands perfect for delicate tasks, and her quiet demeanor making her nearly invisible to the white family she served. Master Jonathan Whitfield was a man of considerable wealth, having inherited both the plantation and a shipping business from his father. He lived in the mansion with his wife, Catherine, and their 3 children. Margaret, age 10, Robert, age 8, and little William, barely 5 years old. To the outside world, the Whitfields appeared to be a respectable family, attending church each Sunday and hosting elaborate dinner parties, where Charleston's elite would gather to discuss politics, business, and the proper management of their human property. But behind the closed doors of the mansion, a different story unfolded. Jonathan Whitfield possessed a cruel streak that seemed to grow stronger with each passing year, and his wife, Catherine, rather than tempering his harshness, often encouraged it with her cold indifference to the suffering of their slaves. Their children, raised in this atmosphere of casual cruelty, learned that dark skin people were less than human objects to be used and discarded at will. Evelyn's primary duty was to serve the Whitfield children during their meals, standing silently behind their chairs with a large palmetto fan, keeping the flies away from their food in the stifling Charleston heat. For hours each day, she would wave the fan back and forth, her small arms aching from the repetitive motion, while the children ate their elaborate meals, and spoke about her as if she were not there. "Papa, why does Evelyn's skin look so dirty all the time?" little William asked one afternoon, his mouth full of honey cake. "Because that is how God made her people, son," Jonathan replied, not looking up from his plate. "They are meant to work for us, and their dark skin shows they are built for labor under the sun." Margaret, the eldest daughter, had developed a particular fondness for tormenting Evelyn. She would deliberately knock over her water glass, then demand that Evelyn clean it up immediately, all while continuing to fan the table. If Evelyn's movement slowed even slightly, Margaret would pinch her arm hard enough to leave bruises, then smile sweetly at her parents as if nothing had happened. "Evelyn's being lazy again, Mama," Margaret would announce during these moments. "She is not fanning properly." Catherine Whitfield would look up from her embroidery with cold eyes. Evelyn, you know better than to shirk your duties. Perhaps you need to spend some time in the punishment room to remember your place. The punishment room was a small, windowless space beneath the kitchen stairs where disobedient slaves were locked away with only bread and water. Evelyn had spent countless hours in that dark place, her young mind racing with thoughts of escape, revenge, or simply the hope that someone somewhere might care about her suffering. As the months passed, Evelyn began to notice things that the Whitfield family never suspected she could understand. She heard Jonathan discussing his financial troubles with his wife late at night, complaining that the shipping business was struggling and that he might need to sell some of his slaves to cover his debts. She observed the way Catherine would slip liniment into her evening tea, seeking escape from her own unhappiness in the opium-based medicine. Most importantly, she learned the routines of the house, knowing exactly when each family member would be asleep and which doors would be locked or unlocked. The other slaves on the plantation treated Evelyn with a mixture of pity and caution. Her position in the main house meant she heard things that could be dangerous to know, and her youth made the older slaves protective of her, while simultaneously keeping their distance. Old Moses, the stable hand who had been on the plantation since before Evelyn was born, was the only one who would speak to her openly about the realities of their situation. "Child, you got fire in your eyes that is going to get you killed if you ain't careful," he warned her one evening as she helped him feed the horses. "I have seen that look before, and it never ends well for our kind." "I do not care," Evelyn whispered back, her voice barely audible above the sound of the horses eating their oats. "I would rather die than live like this forever." Moses grabbed her small shoulder with his weathered hand. "Don't talk like that. Girl, death ain't no escape. It is just the end of everything. You got to be smart. Got to wait for the right moment if you ever going to be free." But Evelyn was tired of waiting. Every day brought fresh humiliations and cruelties, and the child's mind began to turn toward darker thoughts. She started paying attention to the way the oil lamps were filled and lit each evening, noticing how the long curtains in the parlor hung close to the fireplace, observing which rooms had windows that opened easily, and which were sealed tight against the night air. The turning point came on a sweltering July evening when the Whitfield family was entertaining guests for dinner. Evelyn stood behind the children's chairs as usual, fanning them while they ate course after course of rich food. The adults at the main table were discussing the recent slave uprising in Virginia, their voices carrying clearly across the dining room. Nat Turner and his followers got what they deserved, Jonathan declared, raising his wine glass. Hanging was too good for them. Should have made examples of them all. I heard they killed women and children. One of the female guests said with a shudder, "How could human beings do such terrible things?" Catherine laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "My dear, you forget that they are not human beings." "Not really. They are closer to animals, and animals do not understand right from wrong the way we do. That is why they need firm guidance." Margaret, listening to the adult conversation with rapt attention, suddenly turned to look at Evelyn. "Do you think Evelyn would try to kill us in our sleep if she had the chance?" "Papa." The entire table fell silent, all eyes turning to stare at the small girl with the palmetto fan. Evelyn felt her heart pounding in her chest, but she kept her expression blank and continued her steady fanning motion. Jonathan studied her with calculating eyes. What do you think? Evelyn. Would you harm your master's family if you could? It was a trap, and Evelyn knew it. Any answer she gave would be wrong. If she said no, they would know she was lying. If she said yes, they would punish her severely. So she did the only thing she could do. She remained silent and kept fanning. You see, Jonathan said to his guests with satisfaction, they are incapable of higher reasoning. She does not even understand the question. But Evelyn understood perfectly. She understood that these people saw her as less than human, that they would never see her as anything more than property, and that her life would always be subject to their whims and cruelties. In that moment, standing in the elegant dining room, surrounded by people who considered her existence meaningless, Evelyn made a decision that would change everything. After the guests departed and the family retired to their rooms, Evelyn went about her usual evening duties. She helped clear the dinner dishes, swept the dining room floor, and extinguished most of the oil lamps throughout the house. But instead of going to her small quarters behind the kitchen, as she did every night, she hid in the pantry and waited. The house grew quiet as midnight approached. She could hear Jonathan's heavy snoring from the master bedroom upstairs and the occasional creak of floorboards as someone moved about in the night. Evelyn waited until she was certain everyone was deeply asleep, then crept out of her hiding place and made her way to the parlor. The room was dark except for the dying embers in the fireplace. But Evelyn's eyes had adjusted to the darkness during her long wait. She could see the heavy velvet curtains that hung from floor to ceiling, the expensive furniture that Jonathan was so proud of, and most importantly, the oil lamp that sat on the side table, still burning with a low flame. For a moment, Evelyn hesitated. She thought about old Moses and his warnings, about the other slaves who would surely suffer if she went through with her plan, about the possibility that she might escape and find freedom somewhere far from Charleston. But then she remembered Margaret's casual cruelties, Catherine's cold indifference, Jonathan's cruel laughter, and the way they had all discussed her as if she were a dangerous animal that needed to be controlled. With steady hands that belied her 12 years, Evelyn lifted the oil lamp from the table and carried it to the long curtains. The flame flickered in the slight breeze from her movement, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She held the lamp against the heavy fabric and watched as the fire caught, spreading slowly at first, then with increasing speed as it climbed toward the ceiling. The flames were beautiful in their destruction, orange and yellow tongues licking hungrily at the expensive furnishings. Evelyn stood transfixed for a moment, watching her act of rebellion take physical form. Then remembering that she had very little time before the fire would be discovered, she quietly set the empty lamp on the floor and walked to the front door. The door was locked, as she had expected, but Evelyn had learned long ago how to work the mechanism. She turned a heavy key and slipped outside into the warm Charleston night. Behind her, she could already see the orange glow growing brighter in the parlor windows. Instead of running immediately, Evelyn walked calmly to the garden behind the house, where she had spent many hours tending to Catherine's prized roses. She sat down on the stone bench, where she had often been forced to wait while being punished for various infractions, and watched as her act of vengeance unfolded. The fire spread faster than she had anticipated. Within minutes, the entire first floor of the mansion was ablaze, and she could see flames beginning to lick at the second-story windows. It was then that the screaming began. Margaret's voice cut through the night air first, high and panicked, as she realized that her room was filling with smoke. Then came Robert's terrified cries, followed by little William sobbing, pleading for his parents. Jonathan's deep voice boomed over the chaos as he shouted orders and tried to organize an escape. But the fire had already consumed the main staircase, trapping the family on the upper floors. Catherine's screams were perhaps the most chilling, not because they were louder than the others, but because they carried a note of disbelief that such a thing could be happening to her. She had lived her entire life believing that her wealth and status protected her from any real harm, and the reality of her situation seemed to break something fundamental in her mind. Evelyn sat perfectly still on the stone bench, her dark skin allowing her to blend into the shadows as she watched the destruction she had wrought. She felt no joy in the screams, no satisfaction in the terror of the children she had served for so long. Instead, she felt a strange emptiness, as if something essential had been burned out of her along with the mansion. The fire continued to rage, and Evelyn knew that she needed to move soon. Dawn was still hours away, but the flames were bright enough to be seen for miles. Someone would surely come to investigate. She stood up from the bench and walked to the edge of the property, where the manicured gardens gave way to the wild marshland that stretched toward the Ashley River. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the roof collapsing, sending showers of sparks into the night sky. The screaming had stopped, though whether from death or rescue, Evelyn could not tell, and found that she did not particularly care. Her act was complete, and now she faced the uncertain future that awaited her. As she reached the edge of the swamp, Evelyn paused to look back one more time at what had been her entire world for 12 years. The mansion was now a pillar of fire against the dark sky, its white columns blackened and crumbling, its elegant rooms reduced to ash and memory. She had destroyed not just a building, but a way of life, a system of cruelty and oppression that had it seemed as permanent and unchangeable as the stars themselves. The thought should have frightened her. But instead, Evelyn felt a curious sense of peace. She had chosen her own destiny for the first time in her life, had refused to accept the role that others had forced upon her. Whatever happened next, it would be the result of her own actions, not the whims of masters who saw her as less than human. She kicked off the rough shoes that marked her as a slave and stepped barefoot into the dark water of the marsh. The mud was warm between her toes, and the sounds of the swamp, frogs and insects, and the splash of small creatures moving through the water seemed to welcome her into their hidden world. Evelyn began to walk deeper into the marshland, following paths that only she could see, guided by instinct she had never known she possessed. The fire behind her grew smaller with each step, though its glow continued to light the sky like a second sunrise. She did not look back again. The news of the fire spread quickly through Charleston the next morning. By the time the sun rose over the Ashley River, crowds of curious onlookers had gathered at the ruins of the Whitfield mansion. The fire had burned so hot and fast that little remained except the blackened skeleton of the building and the charred remnants of what had once been one of the city's most beautiful homes. Search parties were organized immediately to look for survivors, but it quickly became apparent that no one had escaped the blaze. The bodies of Jonathan, Catherine, Margaret, Robert, and little William were found in their beds, overcome by smoke before they could flee. The discovery sent shockwaves through Charleston's white community, who had always believed that their wealth and status protected them from such tragedies. More disturbing to the authorities was the discovery that Evelyn Carter, The young slave girl who had served in the house was nowhere to be found. A search of the slave quarters revealed that she had not slept in her bed the night before, and none of the other slaves claimed to know where she might have gone. The investigation that followed was thorough, but fruitless. Investigators found the oil lamp in the parlor, its position suggesting that it had been deliberately placed near the curtains rather than accidentally knocked over. Bare footprints in the garden led toward the marshland, but the trail disappeared into the maze of waterways and muddy islands that stretched for miles along the coast. Some of the other slaves were questioned harshly about Evelyn's whereabouts, but they genuinely knew nothing about her plans or her escape route. Old Moses, when pressed by the authorities, claimed that the girl had seemed troubled in recent days, but had given no indication of planning anything destructive. She was just a child, he told the investigators, his voice carefully neutral, 12 years old and scared of her own shadow most days. I can't imagine her doing something like this. But privately, Moses was not surprised. He had seen the fire building in Evelyn's eyes for months, had recognized the same desperate fury he had felt in his own youth before years of slavery had beaten it out of him. He understood why she had done it, even if he could never approve of the methods she had chosen. The search for Evelyn continued for weeks, with tracking dogs brought in from neighboring plantations and rewards offered for any information about her whereabouts. Posters were put up throughout the city showing her description and warning citizens to be on the lookout for a dangerous runaway slave. But despite all these efforts, no trace of the girl was ever found. Some believed that she had drowned in the marshes, her small body swept away by the tides and currents that made the coastal waters so treacherous. Others thought she might have been taken in by sympathetic free blacks or abolitionists who had helped her escape to the north. A few whispered that she had been killed by wild animals in the swamp, her bones picked clean by alligators and her remains scattered across the muddy islands where no human searcher could find them. But there were also those who claimed to have seen her in the months and years that followed. Travelers reported glimpses of a young black girl moving through the marshes at dawn or dusk, always alone and always just out of reach. Some said she had grown wild, living off fish and roots and sleeping in the hollow trunks of ancient cypress trees. Others claimed she had found her way to communities of runaway slaves hidden deep in the swampland, places where fugitives could disappear completely from the world of their former masters. The truth was that Evelyn had indeed survived her flight into the marshes, but her life in the months that followed bore little resemblance to anything she had known before. The swampland was a harsh teacher, demanding skills she had never needed in her years of domestic service. She learned to catch fish with her bare hands, to identify which roots and berries were safe to eat, to build shelters from branches and mud that would keep her dry during the violent storms that swept across the coast. More importantly, she learned to trust her own instincts in ways that slavery had never allowed. Every decision about where to sleep, what to eat, which direction to travel was hers alone to make. There were no masters to obey, no schedules to follow, no punishments to fear except those imposed by nature itself. The isolation was perhaps the greatest challenge. After 12 years of being surrounded by people, even people who treated her badly, the silence of the swamp was sometimes overwhelming. She would go days without hearing a human voice, with only the sounds of birds and insects for company. But gradually, Evelyn began to appreciate the peace that came with solitude, the freedom to think her own thoughts, without fear of punishment. She also discovered that she was not entirely alone in the marshland. There were indeed communities of runaway slaves hidden in the most inaccessible parts of the swamp. Groups of men and women who had chosen the uncertain dangers of the wilderness over the certain cruelties of bondage. They called themselves Maroons, taking their name from the Spanish word for fugitive, and they had developed an entire society based on mutual aid and shared resistance to the slave system. Evelyn's first encounter with the Maroons came nearly 3 months after her escape, when she stumbled across a fishing camp built on a small island surrounded by impenetrable stands of cattails. The people there, mostly men who had fled from rice plantations along the coast, were initially suspicious of her youth and her story. But when word spread about the fire at the Whitfield mansion and the mysterious disappearance of the slave girl who had worked there, they began to understand who she was and what she had done. Some of the Maroons were horrified by her actions, believing that the murder of children, even the children of slave owners, was inexcusable. Others saw her as a hero who had struck a blow against their oppressors in a way that none of them had dared to attempt. The debate over Evelyn's place in their community went on for weeks, with arguments breaking out around campfires and dividing families who had found refuge together. In the end, it was an old woman named Ruth who settled the matter. She had been a Maroon longer than anyone else in the community, having escaped from a plantation near Savannah more than 20 years earlier. She had survived Indian attacks, slave catchers, disease, and starvation, and her word carried weight among the refugees. This child did what she felt she had to do. Ruth announced during one of the community meetings, "I ain't going to judge her for it, and neither should any of you all. We all got blood on our hands one way or another, even if it is just our own from the whippings we took. She is here now. She is one of us now. And that is all that matters." So, Evelyn became part of the Maroon community, learning their ways and contributing her own skills to their survival. She proved to be particularly adept at moving through the marsh undetected, her small size and natural stealth making her an excellent scout and messenger between the scattered camps. She also retained some of the domestic skills she had learned in the mansion, particularly cooking and mending, which made her valuable to the predominantly male community. But Evelyn never fully integrated into Maroon society in the way that other refugees did. The fire that had driven her to murder continued to burn within her, making her restless and unpredictable. She would disappear for days at a time, returning with reports of slave catcher movements or news from the outside world, but never explaining where she had been or what she had done during her absences. The other Maroons learned to accept her peculiarities, understanding that she had been damaged by her experiences in ways that might never fully heal. They gave her space when she needed it, welcomed her back when she returned, and asked no questions about the dark moods that would sometimes settle over her for weeks at a time. As the years passed, stories about Evelyn began to spread beyond the Maroon communities and into the slave quarters of plantations throughout the South Carolina Low Country. The tale grew and changed with each telling, sometimes portraying her as an avenging angel who punished cruel masters, other times as a cautionary example of what happened when slaves forgot their place. But in every version of the story, she remained a powerful symbol of resistance, proof that even the most powerless person could strike back against their oppressors. Some of these stories eventually reached the ears of white authorities, who renewed their efforts to capture the fugitive slave girl who had become something of a folk legend. Rewards for her capture increased over the years, and professional slave catchers began to specialize in tracking her through the marshes. But Evelyn had learned the swamp too well, and she always managed to stay one step ahead of her pursuers. By the time she reached her 20th birthday, Evelyn had become something more than human in the minds of many people. Slaves whispered that she could move through the water without leaving ripples, that she could disappear into thin air when threatened, that she could call upon the spirits of the marshland to protect her from harm. Even some whites began to believe that supernatural forces were involved in her continued evasion of capture. The truth was both more and less remarkable than the legend suggested. Evelyn had indeed developed extraordinary skills in wilderness survival, but they were the result of years of careful observation and hard-won experience rather than magic. She knew every island and waterway and hundreds of square miles of marshland, could read the weather patterns and tidal movements like a book, and had learned to live off the land in ways that would have amazed her younger self. More importantly, she had learned to think like her pursuers, to anticipate their movements and stay ahead of their search patterns. She understood that slave catchers relied on dogs, informants, and systematic sweeps of likely hiding places. So, she made sure to avoid all of these things. She moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to leave a trail. She avoided contact with plantation slaves who might betray her for a reward, and she chose hiding spots that were so uncomfortable and inaccessible that no searcher would think to look there. But perhaps most crucially, Evelyn had learned to embrace the fear that others felt toward her. She cultivated her reputation as something otherworldly and dangerous, using it as a weapon to keep both enemies and potential allies at a distance. The isolation that resulted from this strategy was painful, but it was also protective, ensuring that she would never again be vulnerable to kind of betrayal and cruelty she had experienced in her childhood. The Civil War years brought new opportunities and new dangers to Evelyn's life in the marshes. Union forces operating along the South Carolina coast began to recruit former slaves as soldiers and scouts, offering freedom and wages to men who had spent their lives in bondage. Some of the Maroons joined these units, seeing military service as a chance to strike back at their former masters in a more organized way. Evelyn was approached by Union recruiters on several occasions, but she always declined their offers. She had seen too much of war already in her own life, had participated in her own campaign of vengeance, and had no desire to become part of a larger conflict. The freedom she had won for herself in the marshes was precious to her, and she was unwilling to risk it by taking orders from new masters, even masters who claimed to be fighting for her liberation. Instead, she used the chaos of the war years to expand her territory and deepen her knowledge of the coastal region. With Confederate authorities distracted by military concerns and many plantations abandoned or operating with reduced supervision, Evelyn found it easier to move through areas that had been too dangerous to explore before. She began to range as far north as the Santee River and as far south as the Savannah border, mapping every creek and island along the way. It was during one of these explorations that Evelyn made a discovery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. On a small island in the middle of the Kaibehi River, she found the ruins of a plantation house that had been burned during a Union raid. The destruction reminded her immediately of the night she had set fire to the Whitfield mansion, and for a moment she was 12 years old again, watching the flames consume everything she had known. But as she explored the ruins more carefully, Evelyn realized that this fire had been different from hers. The Union soldiers who had burned this house had given the occupants time to escape, had focused their destruction on the building and its contents, rather than the people inside. No children had died in these flames. No innocent lives had been lost in service of a greater cause. The realization forced Evelyn to confront truths about her own actions that she had been avoiding for years. She had told herself that the Whitfield children were not innocent, that they had been raised to perpetuate the system of slavery, and therefore deserved their fate. But standing in the ruins of a house that had been destroyed without loss of life, she was forced to acknowledge that there might have been other ways to strike back at her oppressors. Ways that did not require the blood of children. The guilt and regret that followed this revelation nearly broke her. For months, Evelyn found herself unable to eat or sleep properly. Haunted by memories of Margaret's screams and little William's terrified cries, she began to seek out news of other slave rebellions and resistance activities, trying to understand whether other people in her situation had found ways to fight back without becoming what she had become. What she learned was both comforting and disturbing. There had indeed been many slave rebellions throughout American history, some successful and some not, but very few had involved the deliberate targeting of children. Even Nat Turner's rebellion, which white authorities had used as an example of slave savagery, had primarily focused on adult male slave owners rather than their families. This knowledge forced Evelyn to confront the possibility that her actions had been motivated as much by personal rage and desire for revenge, by principled resistance to slavery. The thought was almost unbearable, suggesting that she had become the monster that her masters had always claimed she was, that in trying to escape the dehumanizing system of bondage, she had instead lost her own humanity. The crisis of conscience lasted for more than a year, during which Evelyn withdrew even further from human contact than usual. She spoke to no one, trusted no one, and began to consider whether it might be better for everyone if she simply disappeared entirely from the world. The marshes that had been her refuge for so long began to feel like a prison, and she found herself wondering if death might not be preferable to a life lived in isolation and regret. But gradually, with time and painful reflection, Evelyn began to find a way forward. She could not undo what she had done, could not bring back the children she had killed, but she could try to ensure that her future actions were guided by something more than rage and vengeance. She began to reach out cautiously to other Maroons and escaped slaves, offering her skills and knowledge in service of their freedom, rather than her own revenge. This shift in perspective led to some of the most meaningful work of Evelyn's adult life. She became a guide for the Underground Railroad, using her intimate knowledge of the coastal marshes to help other fugitive slaves reach safety in Union-controlled territory. She estimated that over the course of the war years, she personally assisted more than 200 people in their escape from bondage, including entire families who might otherwise have been sold away from each other. The work was dangerous and demanding, requiring her to venture closer to populated areas than she had in years, and to trust people she had never met with information that could get them all killed. But it was also redemptive, offering her a way to use the skills she had developed for survival in service of something larger than herself. One of the most challenging rescues involved a group of children who had been separated from their parents during a plantation sale. The youngest was only 6 years old. Barely older than little William Whitfield had been on the night of the fire, leading these children through the treacherous marshes, keeping them quiet and moving despite their fear and exhaustion, forced Evelyn to confront her own capacity for care and protection rather than destruction. When they finally reached the Union lines, after 3 days of careful travel, the oldest child, a girl of about 10, looked up at Evelyn with eyes full of gratitude and trust. "Are you an angel?" she asked in a whisper. Mama said, "Angels sometimes look like regular people. That they help you when you need it most." Evelyn found herself unable to answer the question directly, but she knew that whatever else she might have been, whatever terrible thing she might have done in that moment, she was something better than the person she had been at 12 years old. The knowledge was not enough to erase her guilt, but it was enough to help her continue living with it. The end of the Civil War brought profound changes to the world Evelyn had known. Slavery was officially abolished throughout the United States, and the formerly enslaved people were granted their freedom by law, if not always in practice. Many of the Maroons, who had shared her refuge in the marshes, emerged from hiding to try to build new lives in the free world. Seeking education, employment, and reunion with family members they had not seen for many years, Evelyn was invited to join them, to leave the marshes and try to find her place in the new society that was emerging from the ashes of the old. But she found that she could not bring herself to take that step. The skills that had served her so well in the wilderness seemed irrelevant to life in towns and cities, and the thought of living among large numbers of people again filled her with anxiety. More importantly, she was not sure that she deserved the freedom that others had won through legal and political means. Her own liberation had been purchased with the blood of children, and she was not certain that such a foundation could support a normal life. The marshes had become her penance, as well as her refuge, and leaving them felt like an abandonment of the responsibility she bore for her actions. So Evelyn chose to remain in the wilderness, becoming something of a legend among the people who had known her. Occasionally, former Maroons would return to visit her, bringing news of the outside world and trying to convince her to join them in freedom. But she always declined, claiming that she had found her place and was content to stay there. As the years passed and Reconstruction gave way to the Jim Crow era, Evelyn watched from a distance as the promise of emancipation was slowly betrayed by new forms of oppression and control. She saw former slaves forced into sharecropping arrangements that differed little from bondage, witnessed the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and other terrorist organizations, and observed the systematic stripping away of civil rights that had been briefly granted to her people. The knowledge that she had killed 3 children and accomplished nothing lasting with their deaths was perhaps the cruelest irony of all. The system of white supremacy had survived the Civil War, adapted to new conditions, and found new ways to subjugate black people. The Whitfield children had died for nothing, their lives sacrificed to a moment of rage that had changed nothing fundamental about the world they had lived in. This realization might have driven Evelyn into despair, but instead, it deepened her commitment to the path of redemption she had chosen. She continued to help fugitives and travelers who found their way into the marshes, offering shelter, guidance, and protection to anyone who needed it. She became known among certain communities as someone who could be trusted. Absolutely. Who would never betray a confidence or abandon someone in need. Her reputation eventually reached the ears of researchers and historians who were trying to document the experiences of slavery and resistance in the antebellum South. Several attempts were made to interview her about her experiences, particularly about the fire that had made her famous, but Evelyn always refused to speak with outsiders about her past. She did, however, begin to share her story with some of the people she helped, particularly young people who reminded her of herself at 12 years old. She would tell them about the choices she had made and the consequences that had followed, not to discourage them from resistance, but to help them understand that even justified anger could lead to actions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. There is always another way, she would tell these young visitors. Maybe it takes longer, maybe it is harder, maybe you do not feel as good in the moment, but there is always another way, and you got to look for it before you do something you can't take back. As Evelyn entered her 50s and then her 60s, the physical demands of life in the marshes began to take their toll. Her joints ashed from decades of sleeping on the ground and wading through cold water, and her eyesight began to fail in the dim light of the swamp. She found it increasingly difficult to catch fish and gather food, and for the first time since her escape, she began to consider what would happen when she could no longer care for herself. The decision, when it finally came, was made for her by circumstances beyond her control. A hurricane in 1893 destroyed much of the South Carolina coast, washing away many of the islands where Evelyn had made her camps and killing countless animals and plants that had sustained her for decades. At age 66, weakened by years of hard living and injuries from the storm, she finally accepted help from some of the former Maroons who had been trying to convince to leave the marshes for years. They brought her to a small community outside Charleston where former slaves had pooled their resources to buy land and build homes for themselves. The transition was difficult for someone who had lived alone for more than 50 years. But the community members understood her history and gave her the space she needed while ensuring she had food, shelter, and medical care. Evelyn spent her final years in relative peace, tending a small garden and occasionally sharing her knowledge of medicinal plants with community members who sought her advice. She never spoke publicly about the fire that had made her famous, maintaining her silence even when journalists and historians offered substantial sums for her story. The few people who knew her true identity respected her privacy and kept her secrets. She died quietly in her sleep in 1912 at the age of 75. Her funeral was attended by dozens of people whose lives she had touched during her years in the marshes, though few of them knew the full extent of her story. She was buried in the community cemetery under a simple wooden cross that bore only her name and the years of her birth and death. But Evelyn's story did not end with her death. The legend that had grown up around her continued to evolve and spread, passed down through generations of African-American families who saw in her tale both a warning and an inspiration. Some versions of the story emphasized the tragedy of children caught in the crossfire of adult conflicts, while others focused on the courage required to strike back against oppression regardless of the consequences. In the 1960s, during the height of the civil rights movement, Evelyn's story was rediscovered by activists and scholars who saw parallels between her situation and the ongoing struggle for racial justice. Some viewed her as an early example of armed resistance to white supremacy, while others used her story to illustrate the psychological damage that oppression could inflict on its victims. The debate over how to interpret Evelyn's legacy continues to this day. Was she a freedom fighter who used the only weapon available to her, or was she a traumatized child who allowed her pain to drive her to inexcusable violence? The answer perhaps depends as much on the perspective of the person asking the question as it does on the historical facts of the case. What cannot be disputed is the lasting impact of her actions on both the Charleston community and the broader conversation about slavery and resistance in American history. The fire that consumed the Whitfield mansion became a symbol of the rage that simmered beneath the surface of seemingly peaceful plantation life. A reminder that the system of human bondage could never be entirely secure as long as it depended on the cooperation of people who had every reason to hate it. The site where the Whitfield mansion once stood is now a small park in downtown Charleston. With no marker to indicate what happened there on that July night in 1839, the city has chosen to forget the specifics of the tragedy, preferring to focus on more palatable aspects of its antebellum history. But among certain communities, the memory persists, passed down through stories and songs that keep alive the complex legacy of a 12-year-old girl who chose violence over submission and then spent the rest of her life trying to understand what that choice had cost her. Historians who have studied the case note that Evelyn's story illustrates many of the broader themes of slavery and resistance in the American South. Her experience demonstrates how the dehumanizing effects of bondage could drive even children to desperate acts, how the isolation and powerlessness of enslaved people could lead to explosive violence when other forms of resistance seemed impossible, and how the trauma of such experiences could shape entire lifetimes. At the same time, her later work with the Underground Railroad and her efforts to help other fugitive slaves suggests that redemption and positive change were possible even for someone who had committed terrible acts in her youth. Her story thus becomes not just a tale of violence and revenge, but a meditation on the possibility of moral growth and the complex relationship between justice and mercy. The marshlands where Evelyn spent most of her adult life have changed dramatically since her time. Much of the area has been drained for development or altered by industrial projects, and the communities of Maroons that once provided refuge for escaped slaves have long since disappeared. But guides who take tourists through the remaining wetlands sometimes tell stories about the ghost of a young woman who can still be seen moving through the water at dawn, forever searching for something she lost long ago. Whether or not such sightings have any basis in reality, they speak to the enduring power of Evelyn's story to capture the imagination and provoke reflection on difficult questions about justice, violence, and the long-term consequences of oppression. Her life reminds us that the victims of injustice are complex human beings capable of both great courage and terrible mistakes, and that the line between heroism and tragedy is often thinner than we would like to believe. In the end, Evelyn Carter remains an enigmatic figure whose true motivations and feelings can never be fully known. She left behind no written records, gave no interviews, and took her deepest thoughts with her to the grave. What we do know is that a 12-year-old girl, pushed beyond her breaking point by years of cruelty and dehumanization, made a choice that would define the rest of her life and create a legend that continues to resonate more than a century. And at a half later, her story serves as a powerful reminder of the human cost of slavery, not just in terms of the millions who suffered under its yoke, but in terms of the psychological and moral damage it inflicted on both its victims and its perpetrators. It illustrates how systems of oppression can create cycles of violence that extend far beyond their official boundaries, leaving scars that may never fully heal. But perhaps most importantly, Evelyn's story demonstrates the fundamental truth that human beings, no matter how powerless they may seem, always retain the capacity to choose their own destiny. whether they choose wisely or poorly, whether they are driven by love or hate, whether they succeed or fail. The act of choosing itself is an assertion of humanity that no system of oppression can entirely suppress. The flames that consumed the Whitfield mansion on that summer night in 1839 have long since been extinguished. But the questions they raised about justice, vengeance, and the price of freedom continue to burn in the American consciousness. Evelyn Carter's story reminds us that the past is never truly past, that the consequences of historical injustices continue to shape our present. And understanding these complexities is essential for anyone who hopes to build a more just and equitable future. In recent years, some historians and community activists have called for the installation of a memorial marker at the site of the former Whitfield plantation, not to celebrate the violence that occurred there, but to acknowledge the complex history of slavery and resistance in Charleston. The proposal has generated considerable controversy, with some arguing that such a marker would glorify terrorism, while others contend that it would provide necessary historical context for understanding the full scope of the slavery experience. The debate reflects broader tensions in American society about how to remember and commemorate difficult aspects of our shared past. Like many stories from the era of slavery, Evelyn's tale resists simple moral categorization, forcing us to grapple with uncomfortable truths about the ways which oppression can corrupt both its victims and its perpetrators. What emerges from a careful examination of her life is not a clear hero or villain, but a fully human individual whose actions were shaped by circumstances that no child should ever have to endure. Her story challenges us to think more deeply about the roots of violence in our society, the long-term effects of trauma and dehumanization, and the possibility of redemption even in the wake of terrible choices, as we continue to struggle with issues of racial justice, inequality, and the legacy of slavery in contemporary America. Evelyn Carter's story offers both warnings and insights that remain relevant today. It reminds us that the pursuit of justice must always be tempered by considerations of mercy and human complexity, and that the most powerful acts of resistance are often those that affirm, rather than deny, our shared humanity. The 12-year-old girl who walked into the Charleston marshes on that summer night in 1839 was forever changed by the choices she made, but she was not forever defined by them. Her subsequent life demonstrated that even those who have done terrible things retain the capacity for growth, redemption, and positive contribution to the world around them. In the end, perhaps that is the most important lesson of Evelyn Carter's extraordinary and troubling life, that human beings are capable of both great evil and great good, sometimes within the same person, and sometimes within the same lifetime. Her story stands as a testament to the complexity of the human experience and the enduring power of choice. Even in the darkest of circumstances, the legacy of that summer night in 1839 continues to ripple through time, touching the lives of people who have never heard Evelyn's name, but who live in a world shaped by the struggles and choices of those who came before them. Her story reminds us that history is not just a collection of dates and facts, but a living force that continues to influence our present and will continue to shape our future for generations to come. The impact of Evelyn's actions extended far beyond the immediate destruction of the Whitfield mansion and the tragic loss of life that accompanied it. In the months following the fire, insurance companies throughout the South began requiring additional security measures for properties with large slave populations, recognizing for the first time that the people they held in bondage might pose a genuine threat to their investments. plantation owners started installing iron bars on upper-story windows and began sleeping with loaded firearms within easy reach, transforming their elegant homes into fortresses designed to protect them from the very people upon whom their wealth depended. The psychological impact on Charleston's white community was perhaps even more profound than these physical changes. For generations, the city's elite had constructed an elaborate mythology around slavery that portrayed enslaved people as contented children who were grateful for the care and guidance of their benevolent masters. The idea that a 12-year-old house slave could deliberately murder an entire family shattered this comfortable fiction and forced them to confront the reality that their system of human bondage was built on a foundation of barely contained rage and resentment. Local newspapers initially tried to downplay the significance of the fire, describing it as an isolated incident carried out by a mentally disturbed individual who did not represent the attitudes of the broader slave population. But as rumors spread about Evelyn's escape and the failure of extensive search efforts to locate her, the story took on a life of its own. Whispered conversations in drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs revealed deep anxieties about the reliability of domestic slaves and the possibility that other households might harbor similar threats. Some families responded by selling their house slaves and relying instead on hired white servants, despite the significant increase in cost this represented. Others implemented new rules restricting slave movement within their homes, requiring constant supervision of domestic workers, and eliminating the kind of intimate access to family quarters that had made Evelyn's crime possible. A few families left Charleston altogether, relocating to cities where they felt the slave population was more manageable or where they could live without constant dependence on enslaved labor. The ripple effects extended into the slave community as well, though in more complex and contradictory ways. Many enslaved people were horrified by the murder of children, regardless of their feelings about the adults who owned them. The deliberate targeting of Margaret, Robert, and little William crossed a moral line that even some of the most rebellious slaves were unwilling to cross. And debates about the ethics of Evelyn's actions divided slave quarters throughout the region. At the same time, there was no denying that her successful escape had demonstrated something that many had thought impossible: that a young slave could strike back at her oppressors and disappear completely from the world of her plantation and masters. The fact that extensive search efforts had failed to recapture her gave hope to other potential runaways and inspired a new wave of escape attempts throughout the South Carolina Low Country. The authorities' response to this surge in runaway activity was swift and brutal. Patrols were increased, punishments for captured fugitives were made more severe, and new laws were passed restricting slave movement and assembly. The system of control that existed on the plantations was tightened in response to the threat personified by Evelyn, making the lives of the enslaved people even more difficult, while simultaneously demonstrating their capacity for passive resistance. Professional slave catchers saw an opportunity for themselves in the manhunt for Evelyn and began advertising their services, specializing in capturing fugitives in the coastal marshes. These men, often accompanied by packs of specially trained bloodhounds, developed new methods for pursuing runaway slaves through the difficult terrain where Evelyn had found refuge. Their successes in capturing other fugitives fostered a growing confidence that they would ultimately find the girl who had become the most wanted fugitive in South Carolina. But Evelyn's knowledge of the marshlands and her ability to move through them undetected proved superior to even the most experienced trackers. She learned to use the patterns of the tides to obscure her trail, to move through areas where dogs could not follow, and to find hiding places so remote and inaccessible that no search party would think to look there. Even more importantly, she developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when she was being pursued, often changing direction or going to ground hours before her pursuers arrived in the area. This exhausting game of cat and mouse between Evelyn and her hunters became the stuff of legend throughout the region. Stories circulated about close calls where slave catchers found her campfires still smoldering, but no trace of the girl herself. About hounds that were stopped at the water's edge and refused to continue tracking. About searchers who reported seeing a small figure moving through the marsh, but found nothing upon investigation. Some of these stories were undoubtedly exaggerated or entirely fabricated, but enough documented near misses occurred to establish Evelyn's reputation as someone who possessed an almost magical power of evasion. The longer she remained free, the more her legend grew, and the more her pursuers began to doubt whether she could ever be captured by conventional means. The financial cost of the search efforts was colossal. The rewards for Evelyn's capture eventually reached sums sufficient to purchase several prime field hands. Insurance companies that had paid out claims for the destroyed Whitfield mansion were particularly motivated to see her brought to justice, both to recover their losses and to demonstrate that such acts would not go unpunished. But as months turned into years and years into decades, even the most determined pursuers began to accept that she might never be found. During the 1840s and 1850s, Evelyn's story became intertwined with the broader national debate over slavery that was increasingly dividing the country. Abolitionists in the North seized upon her tale as evidence of the system's inherent brutality, arguing that only the most extreme oppression could drive a child to such desperate measures. They published pamphlets and gave speeches describing her actions as a natural response to the unnatural institution of human bondage, though they were careful to focus on her resistance rather than the specific details of what she had done. Pro-slavery advocates in the South used her story for their own purposes, citing it as evidence that enslaved people were inherently violent and dangerous when not kept under strict control. They argued that the tragedy at the Whitfield mansion demonstrated the need for even harsher measures to maintain order and discipline among the slave population, using Evelyn's actions to justify increased restrictions and punishments for all enslaved people. Neither side appeared genuinely interested in understanding the complex psychological and moral dimensions of her story, preferring instead to use it as ammunition in their broader political battle. This reduction of her experience to a simple moral tale did a disservice to the real human complexity of her situation, but it also ensured that her name remained in the public consciousness long after many had forgotten the specific details of her crime. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 brought a new wave of fortune seekers through Charleston, and some of these travelers carried Evelyn's story westward with them as they made their way to the mining camps and boomtowns of the frontier. Her tale found fertile ground among people who were themselves living beyond the boundaries of conventional society, and she became a kind of folk hero to those who saw themselves as rebels defying established authority. Versions of her story began to appear in the sensational newspapers and dime novels that served as popular entertainment in mining camps and frontier settlements. These accounts took considerable liberties with the facts, often transforming her into a much older and more deliberately political figure than she had actually been. Some stories portrayed her as a beautiful and mysterious woman who used her feminine was to seduce and destroy her oppressors, while others depicted her as a fierce warrior who led armies of escaped slaves in battles against plantation owners. These fictional elaborations may have distorted the historical truth of evil in story, but they also demonstrated its enduring power to inspire and captivate audiences who were far removed from the specific historical context of South Carolina slavery. Her transformation into a figure of popular culture ensured that her legacy would survive even as the society that had produced her was transformed by war and Reconstruction. The approach of the Civil War brought new urgency to the question of what would happen to people like Evelyn when the conflict finally ended. Union military planners were aware that thousands of escaped slaves were living in remote areas throughout the South, and they began to develop strategies for incorporating these communities into their war effort. Recruiters were sent into the marshlands and mountain hideouts, where maroon communities were known to exist, offering military service, wages, and legal protection to men who had been living as fugitives. Evelyn's response to these overtures was complicated by her unique position within the fugitive community. Her reputation as the girl who had burned the Whitfield mansion made her something of a celebrity among the Maroons, but it also made her a potentially valuable propaganda tool for the Union cause. Military officials who learned of her presence in the marshes were eager to recruit her as both a scout and a symbol, believing that her story would inspire other enslaved people to join the Union effort. But Evelyn remained deeply suspicious of all forms of organized authority. Having learned through bitter experience that those who claimed to act in her best interests often had their own agendas, she had seen how both abolitionists and pro-slavery advocates had used her story for their own purposes, and she was reluctant to allow Union officials to do the same thing. Her refusal to emerge from hiding and join the Union caused frustrated military planners who believed she could have been instrumental in their efforts to liberate the enslaved population of South Carolina. Instead, Evelyn chose to support the Union cause in her own way, using her knowledge of the coastal region to assist individual escapes rather than participating in large-scale military operations. She became one of the most effective conductors on the Underground Railroad, developing escape routes through the marshes that were virtually impossible for Confederate authorities to patrol or disrupt. Her intimate knowledge of tidal patterns, weather conditions, and hiding places allowed her to move groups of fugitives with remarkable success rates. The work was emotionally challenging as well as physically demanding, leading families with young children through the treacherous marsh terrains. Evelyn to confront her own past in ways that were often painful. Seeing the terror in a child's eyes as they waded through dark water reminded her of her own childhood fears, while witnessing the fierce protectiveness of parents trying to keep their families together highlighted the tragedy of what she had done to the Whitfield children and their parents. One particularly difficult rescue involved a woman named Martha who was trying to escape with her 3 young sons after learning that they were about to be sold to different plantations. The youngest boy, barely 4 years old, bore a striking resemblance to William Whitfield, and caring for him during the 3-day journey to Union lines brought back memories that Evelyn had spent years trying to suppress. The child's innocent trust in her guidance, his willingness to follow her into dangerous and unfamiliar territory, based on nothing more than his mother's assurance that she would keep him safe, forced Evelyn to confront the magnitude of what she had taken from the Whitfield children. They had trusted the adults in their lives to protect them, just as this little boy trusted her, and she had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. But the successful completion of the rescue also demonstrated how far she had come from the rage-filled child who had set fire to the mansion. The skills she had developed for survival and evasion were now being used to preserve life rather than destroy it, and the knowledge she had gained through years of isolation was helping to reunite families rather than tear them apart. The transformation was not complete, and it could never fully atone for what she had done, but it represented a form of redemption that she had not believed possible in the early years of her exile. The end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery created new opportunities and challenges for Evelyn and the communities she had served. Many of the people she had helped escape were eager to return to South Carolina to search for family members they had left behind, and they asked her to guide them back through the same marshes she had used to lead them to freedom. These reverse journeys were often more dangerous than the original escapes, as the countryside was filled with Confederate deserters, disbanded military units, and groups of former slave owners who were violently opposed to the new social order. Evelyn found herself serving as both guide and protector for these returnees, using her knowledge of the region to help them avoid the roving bands of armed men who posed a constant threat to freed slaves traveling through rural areas. She developed new routes that avoided known trouble spots and established supply caches that could sup groups of travelers who might need to hide for extended periods. The work brought her into contact with representatives of the Freedmen's Bureau and other federal agencies that were trying to help former slaves transition to freedom. These officials were fascinated by her story and eager to document her experiences for their reports to Washington. But Evelyn remained reluctant to share details about her past or to allow her activities to be publicized. She understood that her effectiveness as a guide depended partly on her ability to move through the region undetected, and she was concerned that too much attention from federal authorities might compromise her ability to help people who still needed her assistance. Some borough officials respected her wishes and worked with her quietly, providing supplies and information that helped her rescue efforts without requiring her to submit to formal interviews or documentation. Others were more persistent in their attempts, convinced her to emerge from the shadows and take on a more public role in reconstruction efforts. They argued that her story could inspire other former slaves and demonstrate the possibilities for redemption and positive change that the new era represented. But Evelyn had seen enough of how her story could be manipulated and misused to be deeply skeptical of such promises. She preferred to work directly with individuals and families who needed help, avoiding the political complications that came with more formal involvement in reconstruction programs. Her approach was pragmatic rather than ideological, focused on immediate human needs rather than broader soul transformation. This philosophy sometimes put her at odds with other civil rights activists who believed that more dramatic and public forms of resistance were necessary to secure lasting change for African Americans. Some argue that her withdrawal from public life represented a form of cowardice, a refusal to take responsibility for the political implications of her earlier actions. Others contended that her continued isolation perpetuated the very system of secrecy and shame that had enabled slavery to persist for so long. Evelyn understood these criticisms and sometimes wondered if she was indeed taking the easy path by avoiding public engagement with the political struggles of her time. But she also knew that her particular skills and experiences made her uniquely valuable in ways that might be lost if she tried to become a conventional political activist. The marshlands that had been her refuge for so long continued to provide sanctuary for people who needed to travel through the region. Undetected, and her knowledge of these areas remained essential for their safety. The establishment of Jim Crow laws in the 1880s and 1890s created new categories of people who needed the kind of assistance Evelyn could provide. African Americans who challenged segregation laws or who were targeted by white vigilante groups sometimes found it necessary to disappear temporarily until tensions cooled, and the escape routes she had developed during the slavery era proved adaptable to these new forms of oppression. She also began working with white allies who were involved in civil rights activities and who occasionally needed safe passage through hostile territory. These partnerships were complicated by the racial dynamics of the time, but they demonstrated Evelyn's ability to judge people as individuals rather than simply as representatives of racial groups. Her experiences had taught her that human nature was complex and that people of all backgrounds were capable of both great kindness and terrible cruelty. One such collaboration involved a white newspaper editor from Charleston who had written articles critical of lynching and other forms of racial violence. When threats against his life became serious enough to force him to leave the city temporarily, Evelyn provided guidance that allowed him to reach safety in a neighboring state. The journalist later wrote about his experience without revealing her identity, describing only his rescue by an angel of the marshes who had appeared when he needed help most and disappeared again once he was safe. Such incidents reinforced Evelyn's reputation as a mysterious and almost supernatural figure who intervened in human affairs when justice required it. The legend that had grown up around her during the slavery era adapted to new circumstances, while maintaining its essential elements of mystery, power, and moral complexity. She became a figure who existed on the boundaries between myth and reality, someone whose actual presence could never be confirmed, but whose influence could be felt by those who needed her help. As she entered the final decades of her life, Evelyn began to reflect more systematically on the choices she had made and the legacy she would leave behind. The young girl who had killed 3 children in a moment of desperate rage had become an elderly woman who had spent more than 50 years trying to atone for that act through service to others. The question of whether her later actions had balanced the scales of justice remained unanswerable, but she had found a measure of peace in the knowledge that she had used her remaining years constructively rather than destructively. The physical demands of life in the marshes had taken their toll, and she was increasingly dependent on the network of friends she had developed over the decades. Former fugitives who had prospered in freedom sometimes returned to provide financial support and supplies, while younger activists carried on much of the physical work of guiding people through dangerous territory. Evelyn's role gradually shifted from active fieldwork to planning and coordination, using her accumulated knowledge to help others develop their own skills as guides and protectors. This transition was not without its emotional challenges. Evelyn had defined herself for so long through her ability to survive independently in the wilderness that acknowledging her growing limitations felt like a fundamental threat to her identity. The self-reliance that had enabled her escape from slavery and sustained her through decades of exile was no longer sufficient to meet her needs, and learning to accept help from others required a form of vulnerability that did not come easily to her. But the process also revealed the depth of the relationships she had formed over the years and the impact her work had made on countless lives. People who had barely known her name nevertheless felt a profound sense of obligation to ensure her welfare. recognizing that their own freedom and safety had depended on her willingness to risk everything for their benefit. The community that formed around her in her final years was a testament to the power of individual actions to create lasting bonds of mutual support and shared responsibility. The story of Evelyn Carter stands as one of the most complex and troubling episodes in the long history of resistance to slavery in the American South. Her actions on that summer night in 1839 cannot be separated from the brutal system that shaped her childhood or from the decades of service that defined her adult life. She remains a figure who defies simple moral categorization, embodying both the destructive potential of unchecked rage and the redemptive power of sustained commitment to helping others. Her legacy continues to resonate in contemporary discussions about justice, violence, and the long-term effects of oppression on individuals and communities. The questions her story raises about the ethics of resistance, the possibility of redemption, and the complex relationship between personal trauma and political action remain as relevant today as they were in the antebellum South. In an era when Americans continue to grapple with the ongoing effects of slavery and systemic racism, Evelyn's story offers both warnings and insights that transcend the specific historical context in which she lived.